Hey guys, and welcome to your final lecture for Poly 201. I've really enjoyed this semester. I'm sorry that I haven't gotten to know you guys very well. It's tough in this digital world, but thank you so much for hanging in there with me. Your final essay is due on Monday, April 26th. You just copy and paste it from your Word document into the body of that email, and then format on Blackboard, and then your final exam is Monday, May 3rd. And you'll have the week to finish that. Today is your final lecture, Media, Power, and Political Communications. We're going to go ahead and dive right into that, and then this is your final lecture, guys. I'm sorry if you see errant balloons or things floating around behind me. We just had my 3-year-old's birthday party here, so hopefully we'll have a few minutes of quiet to get through this. Their text starts out talking about June 2016, the Pulse nightclub shooting, and the two different stories that emerged. One story was talking about a mentally disturbed shooter conflicted about his own sexuality who was interviewed by the FBI for possible terrorist sympathies and on the terror watch list, but still able to buy an assault rifle and be a licensed security guard. Hillary Clinton was a presidential nominee at the time, and she embraced the LGBT community and talked about this assault weapons ban. Her themes were talked about and repeated and woven into a common story that really spread like wildfire. The other story said that the shooting was conducted by a member of ISIS committed to exterminating gays. President Obama at the time was complicit by not using the phrase radical Islamic terrorism and for suspected Muslim sympathies. But the big question was how this guy got in the country and how people like him can be kept out. Trump, who is the presidential nominee at this time, expressed sympathy for the LGBT community and reiterated his call for the ban on immigration from countries that were a perceived threat to Americans, which resonated with his base and really took on wings in social media. The two narratives from the same event existed, right? If you live in one world, you may not have even known the other narrative existed. If you do live in an information bubble, a closed loop of self-reinforcing evidence supporting a particular interpretation of events. It's important to listen to the media sometimes, right? The essential function of communication is to record events, to give meaning to them, to create a story or a narrative about how they fit into the past and stretch into the future. People have done it with legends and myths and holy texts and fairy tales. Humans tell stories. It gives us history and a way of passing down history to new generations. Part of politics is having your narrative accepted as the authoritative account. Storytellers of the past and power holders had a monopoly on control for much of human history because books were in scarce supply and few people could read anyway. Gatekeepers were journalists and media elite who determined what news stories are covered and what are not. But now we live in this constant explosion of narratives from TV news to Facebook. Where do we get our information? Narratives are built from information, and we get that from a wide array of media sources, media being the plural of medium, an agency through which communication between two different entities takes place. You think about a medium, it could be someone who transmits messages from a spiritual world to earthbound souls, or like today's mass media, conveys information cheaply and efficiently from the upper reaches of political world to everyday citizens, kind of the same. Mass media is the means of conveying information to large public audiences cheaply and efficiently. Today, we do more than just watch and listen to the media, though. More is interactive in nature. Media convergence. This is the merging of traditional media with digital communication technologies, such as telecommunications and the internet. Politicians must stay on top of electronic innovation that continually shapes and alters the political world. It's just as important. Please don't stop. Oh, thank you. It's just as important for the media to help carry information back from the citizens as it is to the politicians. The news media relies on the new technology, and almost all the innovations in the media have been developed over the past 200 years, and only in about the last 50 years have they been used commonly. The mass media today. News used to enter the average American's life at only a couple of neatly defined and very predictable points during the day. You read your local morning paper over breakfast, your afternoon paper waited for you when you came home from work. Big city papers were expensive and late unless you lived in a big city. In the 1960s, evening news came on all 3 TV stations at 7:30 p.m. Walter Cronkite was the most trusted face in TV news, unless there was a special event like this, a space shoot, or a tragedy like the JFK assassination. They required a special bulletin. Today, we get a little news from a lot of sources. Only about 20% of Americans get news from newspapers, 25% from the radio, 28% from news and news websites and apps, 30% from network news, 31% from cable TV, and 46% from local TV. But 62% of adults get news from social media, Facebook being the most popular. Millennials are more likely to rely on Facebook for news more than their elders, like your grandparents. They're not really going to be on Facebook, maybe. Baby boomers rely on local television. Gen Xers kind of split the difference. So the younger generations are more likely to get their news from the sources they curate themselves. They choose the source of their news. Older Americans watch whatever is served up to them by the media elite. Though we are exposed to a lot of news, levels of political information are not high. Younger people have a harder time answering questions about domestic policies and public figures than older people. Print media is in deep trouble. In 1941, 1/3 of Americans bought a daily paper. In 2009, 13% did. 2015 was the worst year for print media since the Great Recession. Many papers have ceased publication or moved to a print-online hybrid or simply an online existence. Most towns have only one paper if they have any at all. Journalism has traditionally been paid for by newspapers that have either had their own news bureaus around the world or subscribed to and supported a news service like the Associated Press. The money they paid for these sources came from advertisers who had no other way to reach out to their markets, but now those advertisers have multiple cheap or even free outlets through which to reach customers. We don't know what journalism will look like in a new post-newspaper age. What about radio and television? Radios, which were once kind of state of the art, are now more commonplace. Most Americans have at least one, and 90% say they listen to the radio weekly. 1980s brought talk radio into our lives. They provided an interactive political platform, allowing radio hosts, their guests, and their audience to air their opinions on politics. They had two non-commercial networks, the National Public Radio, NPR, and the Public Radio International. They were funded in small part by the government, but mostly by private donations. But the impact of radio can't even compare with those of TV. In 1950, 9% of homes had a TV. By 1975, 97% had TVs, and 82% of American homes have more than one TV. 54% have three or more, over 80% have cable television. So everybody has a TV, mostly. Live TV viewership has declined, but we use other means now. Nielsen, a marketing firm that tracks audience share, says Americans watch 5 hours of TV a day. This doesn't count what you're watching on another device. We spend about 6 to 8 hours a day at school or at work, so TV accounts for an astounding figure of how Americans spend their leisure time. TV is primarily entertainment. The news has always been secondary, so now there is infotainment, or news shows dressed up as drama and emotion to entice viewers to turn in. America once only had 3 stations, but now they average about 189. We only watch about 17 of them, so stations really focus on specific audiences. Narrowcasting is the targeting of specialized audiences by the media. JFK was the first to really use TV. It was like it was designed for a young, photogenic president. But the TV brought the country together in a community of grief when he was assassinated. Cable stations and C-SPAN, America's Town Hall, offered news around the clock, but not all the news concerns politics. Political shows target particular age groups or ideologies and often is the subject of jokes on TV shows like Saturday Night Live, The Daily Show, etc. Since 2000, most of the major presidential candidates and their wives have appeared on these shows to show that they're likable, regular people and to reach audiences that might not otherwise turn into politics. The internet. The reach of print media and radio and television is dwarfed by the scope and possibilities of the internet. In 2015, 85% of American adults use the internet, 70% have broadband access to their home, and more than half are able to access the internet from smartphones. The internet has revolutionized the way we get our information. It's made politics immediate and personal. We're still dependent on mass media to connect us to our government to create the only real space for public deliberation of issues, but technological developments make possible even newer forms of political community and immediate access to information. Government officials can now communicate with us directly and bypass the traditional press. Visionaries talk of the day when we'll all vote electronically on individual issues from our home computers or phones, but even if we're not there yet, changes in the media are nonetheless revolutionizing the possibilities of democracy as much as the printing press and TV did earlier. News organizations, businesses, occasionally nonprofits devoted to reporting and disseminating news via print, broadcast, or digital media, or a multimedia combination. Most of them are now multimedia ventures. Access is sometimes free, but that's usually a disincentive, and so people are hiding things behind paywalls now. We search for topics we want, and we connect with links with related sites, so we customize our web news. Some sites exist only on the internet and may or may not adopt the conventions, practices, and standards of more conventional media. News aggregators are websites, applications, and software that cull content from other digital sources, like BuzzFeed, The Skim, Google News. They choose articles from other sites to share with their readers, sometimes in combination with original content, some allowing readers to customize their own feeds. The overlapping sources gives us access to more information than ever before, but the task of sorting and evaluating is our own responsibility. The web provides information, but it's also interactive to a degree that far surpasses talk radio or television. Political campaigns really began to take advantage of this in 2008, and they used social media to organize and raise funds and get out the vote. Obama's campaign was skillful at this. The internet has the potential to increase direct participation of citizens in political communities and political discussions, but not all Americans have equal access to the web, so multiple classes of citizenship could form. The new media landscape is fertile for positive changes. Citizen-driven journalism is taking the place of complacent, ratings-driven corporate journalism. Information gathered and disseminated in real time with multiple researchers on the job to correct and assist each other. No one experiment is going to replace what we are now losing in the demise of the news on paper, but over time, the collection of new experiments that do might give us the journalism we need, or maybe not. How does media ownership affect control of the narrative? The ownership structure of the American media has changed dramatically since our founding. Back then, newspapers were partisan instruments dependent on government for their very existence. Today, most news comes from, at least through, massive corporate-owned sources. Media is a big business, on a scale undreamed of by such early journalism entrepreneurs like Joseph Pulitzer and William Hearst, who had fiercely competitive tabloid wars in the 1890s that gave birth to what is known as yellow journalism, as each rushed to attract readers with sensational headlines and stories. Today's mainstream media still exists, but a single figure doesn't dominate a paper or station's editorial policy, and it's no longer only in its original Brent or broadcast form. All are owned by major conglomerates and have huge digital presences. Just 6 corporations, Time Warner, which has merged with AT&T, Disney, Viacom, CBS Corporation, News Corporation Limited, and Comcast, they own most of the major national newspapers, the leading news magazines, the TV networks, as well as publishing houses, movie studios, telephone companies, entertainment firms, and other multimedia operations. Most are also involved in other businesses since we recognize their names, right? Editorial decisions are matters of corporate policy, but not individual judgment, and profit is gospel. Startups tend to be gobbled up by other outlets, of course, and media gets the bulk of their revenue from advertising rather than circulation now. Social media is becoming a more favored news source, but they're not news producers. They use their own formulas to decide what news to expose us to. Cell phone users customize their news streams. Smartphone users are notable for their heavy news consumptions. People who have news on mobile devices are spending longer with the news and getting it from more sources. So tech-savvy news readers are disproportionately well-educated and young, so America's news reading habits may be changing dramatically, and the web may be coming closer to realizing its potential for offering a truly democratic, practical, and free alternative to the corporate-produced news we now receive. How does media ownership impact the news we get? We need to be aware of 5 major consequences. First is the commercial bias, the tendency of the media to make coverage and programming decisions based on what will attract a large audience and maximize profits. People tune in to watch scandals and disasters, and so they're covered extensively. The second is the effort to get and keep large audiences and to make way for increased advertising, which means a reduced emphasis on political news, especially at the local level where older Americans get their news. The third is that the content of the news we get is lightened up, dramatized, and streamlined to keep audiences tuned in. Clickbait, sensational headlines designed to tempt internet users to click through to a specific website. Fourth, corporate ownership of today's mass media means that the media outlets frequently face conflicts of interest in deciding what news to cover or how to cover it. 33% of newspaper editors said they would not feel free to publish news that might harm their parent company. This should make us question what's being left out of the news we receive. And fifth, breaking a news story has always been a point of pride for editors and journalists. Journalists have to walk a fine line between the time spent reporting and getting those stories published before the competition does. This tension becomes even more intense as daily deadlines for print or nightly broadcasts have given the way to the modern 24-hour news cycle. So many want to avoid getting scooped that they sometimes jump the gun and disseminate incorrect information or flat-out lies. For example, Fox and CNN both said Obamacare had been struck down by the Supreme Court before they finished reading all of the Roberts decision, which obviously it hadn't been. Alternatives to the corporate media conglomerates don't define all of our alternatives for getting the news. The explosion of online publishing gives people more alternatives for getting and sharing information that is not subject to a corporate agenda. Government-owned radio and TV can provide an alternative to the for-profit media world. Americans tend to assume that media wholly owned or controlled by the government serves the interests of the government rather than the citizens, but privately owned media are not necessarily free from advertiser influence either. Countries like the UK demonstrate that government-owned sources like the BBC can be bastions of creativity and innovation and can be well-respected gatekeepers. And a small independent press does continue to thrive, but unless they're totally free from advertising, they're not totally free from corporate influence. Almost all of the media are privately owned, but they don't operate without some public control. In the early days of radio, great public enthusiasm for the new medium of radio resulted in so many radio stations that the signal interference threatened to damage the whole industry. So broadcasters asked the government to impose some sort of order. They passed the FCA, the Federal Communications Act, which created the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, as an independent regulatory agency. In 1934, to access the waves, it was a scarce resource, so the government acted to ensure that radio and TV served the public interest by representing a variety of viewpoints. The first is equal time rule. If one candidate speaks, all must have the same opportunity. The fairness doctrine, requiring stations to give free airtime to issues of public concern. And the right of rebuttal, allowing people whose reputations who were damaged on air to respond. All of these have been limited or eliminated since. They remain controversial. Politicians want the rules enforced because they help them air their views publicly. Media owners see these rules as forcing them to air unpopular speakers who damage their ratings and as limiting their ability to decide station policy. They argue broadcast time is no longer a scarce resource, so many outlets and that broadcast media should be subject to the same legal protection as print media. Many of these limitations were abolished with the 1996 Telecommunications Act in order to open up competition and promote diversity in the media markets. But it failed to rein in the media giants and ended up facilitating mergers that concentrated media ownership even more. The law permits ownership of multiple stations as long as they do not reach more than 35% of the market, and nothing prevents the networks themselves from reaching a far larger market through their collective affiliates. This also opened up ways for ownership of cable stations by network owners and allows cable companies to offer many services previously supplied only by telephone companies. The overall effect here is the increased possibility for a media monopoly. Some internet users would favor a policy of net neutrality that would ensure telecommunication companies cannot use their control over internet access to restrict or limit content with price discrimination, and they'd keep the internet unfettered and open to innovation. In 2015, the FCC ruled in favor of net neutrality, ensuring all internet traffic be treated equally. I actually worked for the House Judiciary Committee at the time. It was a really interesting time to be there for that. Corporate ownership doesn't tell us the whole story of modern journalism, though. Mass media are no longer primarily owned by individuals, and much of digital media is filtered through news aggregators that simply link to the reporting of others. But individual journalists continue to be the eyes and ears and nose and legs of the business. They discover, they report, they edit, they publish in newspapers and magazines and on radio and television and the internet. Four roles that journalists play often coexist in a single journalist. They are gatekeepers. They decide the details about what news gets covered or not, and how. Not all journalists share this power equally. They are disseminators. Reporters who confine their role to getting the facts of the story straight and moving the news out to the public quickly, avoiding stories with unverified content, and reaching as wide of an audience as possible. And the third is they are interpreters or investigators. They develop this role in reaction to the criticism and to the growing sophistication of the issues confronting the American public, combining the functions of investigating government's claim, analyzing, interpreting complex problems, and discussing public policies in a timely way. Investigative reporters are journalists who research and verify the truth or political or corporate narratives and claims. For example, muckrakers of the early 20th century who exposed social ills like child labor, latter-day reporters like Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein who exposed Watergate. And the fourth role they can play, I'm sorry, I've got a tickle. The fourth role they can play are called public mobilizers. They develop the cultural and intellectual interests of the public that set the political agenda and let the people express their views. This is closely aligned with a contemporary movement called civic journalism, which is a movement among journalists to be responsive to citizen input in determining what news stories to cover. With the growing presence of the internet as a space where people can communicate and organize, public mobilization is becoming a much more grassroots affair. Who chooses journalism? Journalists are increasingly white and male. They usually focus on issues of concern to white middle-class America and reflect the values of that population at the expense of minority issues and at the expense of poor people. What do journalists believe? It's not the demographics by the ideology of journalists that we are most concerned with. It's the more educated people are, the more liberal their views tend to be. I don't know about that. Journalists tend to be well educated, and they do tend to lean to the left. They strive to leave their values outside the newsroom and do objective work. Studies say there's no discernible bias in the media. But in an effort to combat what has been seen as a leftward slant, conservatives have made an effort to bring what they believe is balance to the news. Rush Limbaugh, Fox News, Drudge Report, Breitbart, Wall Street Journal editorial page. Think of the narratives. Okay, so we need to talk about like spinning a political narrative, right? Think of a narrative that Northerners tell of the Civil War versus what we as Southerners tell about the Civil War. Was it a right to end slavery and restore national unity, or a war of secession because states' rights were violated? Same war, different narrative. When Walter Cronkite visited Vietnam in 1968 and said we were losing the war, LBJ knew he'd lost support from the country because of how trusted Cronkite was, but today there's no consensus on who is the trusted reporter of facts. We like to think that journalism and news gathering is all about facts, and in its purest sense it is. If it isn't true, it isn't a fact. Control of the facts itself can confer power. Discovering and reporting facts in a timely way is power. What we think of the job of the news media is a powerful part of democratic society. Without the facts, we cannot make the good informed decisions about our government that we need to make. Control of the facts, though, can be directed toward goals rather than the health of a democracy. Withholding information needed, releasing information at a strategic time, or refusing to invest resources in uncovering the facts that are all powerful actions that don't lead to good informed decision making. But the facts themselves don't always tell us what we need to know. They often need to be put into context and interpreted so that we know what to make of them, and that's when they become part of a narrative, a story with a meaning and a value. The top tier of American journalists is those who cover politics in D.C. It's a coveted place to be, and along with New York City is where the weaving of the media narratives take place. Though the media elite can have an easier time in controlling the narrative, everyone with a computer or a phone can take part in spreading a compelling story. The mainstream media doesn't have the monopoly it once did. We've talked about a revolving door before, and the same thing in journalism. It's the tendency of public officials, journalists, and lobbyists to move between public and private sector jobs. Journalists taking a position in government, then returning to journalism again, and vice versa. And then the role of the pundit. A pundit is a professional observer and commentator on politics. Traditionally, it's someone with great wisdom. In contemporary media parlance, it's come to mean someone who is skilled in the ways of the media and politics, who can make the trenchant observations and predictions about the political world and help us untangle the complicated implications of political events. 24-hour news means the need for bodies to fill political panels. Some pundits become celebrity journalists who cross over from reporting on public figures to becoming a public figure themselves. Because they receive widespread media coverage, a pronouncement of a pundit carries considerable power. The media are among the main agents of political socialization. They help transfer political values from one generation to the next. They help shape political views in general by narratives they create about the meaning of politics. We're not worried so much about the media telling us what to think as we are with the media telling us what to think about and how to think about it. There are several types of media-related effects on our thinking: agenda setting, framing, persuasion by professional communicators, and a tendency to reduce politics to issues of conflicts and superficial image rather than by substantive policy disputes. Agenda setting. The media's role in defining the relative importance of an issue or event via the amount and prominence of coverage they devote to it. When a TV reporter chooses to cover an event, they're telling us this is important, we should pay attention. Framing, the process through which the media emphasize particular aspects of a story, thereby influencing the public perception of it. Just as a painting can be altered by its frame, a political event can look different to us depending on how the media frames it and what they choose to emphasize in their coverage. Persuasion by professional communicators. Some say the media affect public opinion because viewers who don't often have the time to background to research the issues themselves rely on opinion leaders. But often, especially now with internet and 24-hour news cycles, the communicators on whom the media rely are often people who regularly pass through the revolving door and whose objectivity cannot be taken for granted. The reduction of politics to sound and fury. Reporting on the details of policy wonks is hard and requires diligence and toughness, but such hard work in a nonstop 24-hour news cycle sometimes means journalists don't have the ability or luxury to do the long-form piece or the deep dive into a story. Being under pressure to constantly produce something that people will tune into or click on means a lot of what is being reported on is shallow and meaningless unless a reporter can peg it to a quick and dirty narrative. Horse race journalism. The media's focus on the competitive aspects of the politics rather than actual policy proposals and political decisions, viewing politics as competition between individuals rather than policy differences, which increases cynicism and trivializes what's at stake in campaigns or battles in Congress, and they don't educate the American public this way. Optics, the way a situation, person, or event is presented by the media and perceived by the public. TV focuses on giving us pictures of politics instead of delving beneath the surface, so the focus becomes on optics, which leads us to value more superficial aspects of politics. Soundbite, a brief, snappy excerpt from a public figure's speech that's easy to repeat on the news, the audio equivalent of a snapshot. The attention span of the public has been trained to instant and speedy gratification, so reporters tend to concentrate on developing simplified narratives, developing scandals instead of more relevant news. Feeding frenzy, the executive press coverage of an embarrassing or scandalous subject, the obsession with catching politicians in a lie or in a gaffe, means most politicians are treated as fundamentally untrustworthy, though most do precisely what they say they're going to do. The power of the mainstream media's narrative. The effects of the agenda setting, framing, expert persuasion, and shallow, over-dramatized reporting should not be taken to mean that we are all unwitting dupes of the media. They are not ironclad rules, only tendencies that hold true for some people, but not all. We bring our own armor to the barrage of media effects we face regularly. We filter our news watching through our own narratives constructed on the ideas and values and distinct perspectives that we bring to politics. Selective perception is the phenomenon of filtering incoming information through personal values and interests. If people don't seem to be well informed on issues emphasized by the media, they may or may not see them as playing a role in a narrative or in a role in a narrative they value or have any effect on their lives, leading to cynicism about the media. About half or more of the American public thinks the news is too biased, sensationalized, manipulated by their own special interests, or that reporters offer too many of their own opinions and are negative. If people cease to trust the media become less effective in playing their legitimate roles as well as their more controversial ones, and democracy becomes more difficult to sustain. There is no doubt the media does portray politics in a negative light, and the news reporting emphasizes personality, superficial image, and conflict over substantial policy issues. Is this the media's fault or the responsibility of politicians, their own press officers, who are so obsessed with their own images on TV that they limit access to the media? The effort to control the media can lead to an emphasis on short-term gain over long-term priorities of making the policy decisions with an eye to their political impact, known as the permanent campaign. The idea that governing requires a continual effort to convince the public to sign on to the program, requiring a continual reliance on consultants and emphasis over politics over policy. News management is the efforts of a politician's staff to control the news about the politician. And spin is the interpretation of a politician's words, actions designed to present a favorable image. Modern American politics has become a battle between the press and politicians, and among the politicians themselves, to control the agenda and the narratives that reach the public. A battle of the spin doctors, right? For example, Nixon rehabbed his image after he lost to the media savage JFK. JFK's image as a true war hero, patriot, devoted father, and faithful husband, though clearly they are not all true, they learned that the response is to the image, not the man, since most voters had no contact with the man. So Nixon was repackaged and sold as the new Nixon, and he eventually won election and re-election. When he had to resign, it may have been the inevitable revelation of the real Nixon underneath. Some new news management techniques. You want to have a tight control of information. You want to have tight control of access to the politician. You want to have a concerted effort to bypass the White House press corps. And you want to package the news in sound bites. Leaks, confidential information secretly revealed to the press, serve a variety of purposes. It could be a trial balloon, an official leak to a proposal to determine public reaction to it without risk. Not all presidential administrations are equally accomplished at using these techniques. Reagan was referred to as the model of public relations. Clinton did not manage his media super effective earlier, but by his second term, they were more adept at it. George W. Bush did a great job of news management. Obama was not quite as disciplined as George W. Bush. Obviously, Trump didn't do great with the media. Politicians have to spend time and energy on image considerations, and that doesn't really help them serve the public, but the skills required by an actor and by a statesman aren't the same. Transformation of politics into professional storytelling means we suffer a loss from political accountability, which is the democratic principle that political leaders must answer to the public for their actions. So, growing citizen access increases the engagement, but it blurs the line of journalism. Almost from the beginning, the control of American media has been in the hands of an elite group, whether party leaders or politicians, wealthy entrepreneurs, corporate ownership, financial concerns. Media is more driven by profit than public interest. By ownership and control of the media, they're far removed from the hands of most Americans. But the rapid changes of information technology offers hope that the media can serve the public interest more effectively. Citizen journalism, reporting and commentary by everyday citizens unaffiliated with traditional media outlets and distributed via the web in the forms of blogs, podcasts, or video uploads. They're the modern day equivalent of giving citizens their own printing press and the means to publish their views. It's also an unregulated source, so you do get a great deal of inaccurate and unsubstantiated information. But they do other things to keep the mainstream media accountable. We still need to scrutinize the reporting of citizens as we do the rest of media, but there's no substitute for the critical evaluation of the news. But citizen journalism can provide a new kind of content that is truly independent, open, and democratic in a way that the traditional media sources could never be. Guys, thanks for hanging with me. It has been a wonderful semester. As always, please email me if you have any questions. Don't forget to upload your essay by Monday, and then the following Monday, your final exam will be posted. Thanks so much. Take care.